Once again, we have to talk about British exceptionalism because this is a problem with our politics, it's a problem with our national psyche, which leads to it was damaging not only our reputation abroad, but implementing stuff that hurts the UK as a whole. And this comes from the Financial Times. It pretty much sums it up. British exceptionalism has reached the end of the road. Illustrious history is an insufficient shield against a virus and the grim reality of Brexit. This is not the premiership Boris Johnson anticipated, nor is it the one he looked to be enjoying. A leading author of Brexit and the champion of a new, quote, global Britain, Mr. Johnson had a heroic vision for his first full year. Britain alone would be Britain reborn. The job description did not include battling a deadly virus entirely unforgiving of such grand political sweep. Mr. Johnson is a cavalryman. Coronavirus is an enemy that has to be fought in the trenches. The Prime Minister has been heard to admit his boosterism. Critics call it bluff and bluster. Either way, Mr. Johnson's political trademark has been abiding confidence that will be well for Britain. An illustrious history of inert stoicism and an abundance of optimism are a shield against the slings and arrows of occasional misfortune. This month has been marked in the Downing Street calendar for joyous celebration of British exceptionalism and its modern architect, Winston Churchill. In the great tapestry of myths informing Britain's view of its past, none is so richly embroidered as its defeat of the Nazis in 1945. 5 years earlier, Churchill had stood alone. The SARS-CoV-2 virus has no respect for national character. The planned commemorations for the victorious 75th anniversary fell victim to the tyranny of the coronavirus. The flypast of the Spitfire and Hurricane planes went ahead on the 8th of May. The Queen spoke to the nation with hardy souls hoisted socially distanced street parties, but the spirit was lost to the coalition between forgetting nostalgia and a pathogen. There are many explanations for the delay and the initially weak government reaction that have seen Britain fare relatively bad in the fight against the virus. Some relate resources to the poor mismanagement and some to the missteps of inevitable in the response to such an extraordinary threat. But at the heart of the failure was a yawning gulf between exceptionalism and the relentless focus and organisation needed to stamp out coronavirus. Even as other European nations were shutting down their economies in early March, Britain initially took a relaxed approach. Mr. Johnson was defiant. The threat would be beaten back by a fantastic NHS, fantastic testing systems, a fantastic surveillance systems. The great number of Britons would be The great number of Britons would be little disturbed. Several weeks were lost before Britain followed the rest in locking down its economy. Mr. Johnson still struggles to hit the right political note. Defeating the epidemic demands leadership that is comfortable with the crunchy detail of policy, with an easy grasp of the dull but vital logistics and supplying personal protective equipment and ventilators, and with strategies for testing, tracing and confinement. The mismatch is evident in the exchanges in the House of Commons between Mr. Johnson and Keir Starmer. The keen-witted lawyer, now installed as leader of the opposition of the Labour Party. The Prime Minister's constant struggle to grapple with the nuts and bolts fares badly under Keir Starmer's interrogation of the government's performance. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has shown how it can be done with sure-footed economic response to the pandemic. Officials lauded him for his attention to detail and eagerness to learn. The admiration is spreading to the Tory backbenchers. With some cause, the youthful Mr. Sunak is already being touted as a potential leader. None of this however, was what Mr. Johnson imagined when Britain left the EU at the end of January. A newly forged United Kingdom was on the slipway, Mr. Johnson declared. We are embarking now on a great voyage, a project that no one thought in the international community that this country would have the guts to undertake. When the economy is in recession, the government borrowing and debt piling higher, and unemployment set to rise sharply, the journey no longer looks so enticing. The pandemic promises another turn in the ratchet of deglobalization. Mr. Johnson has precious few allies in his promised crusade for a new era of global free trade. Brexit is being stripped of its fantasies. This week, the EU and its British neighbours embarked on a third round of virtual negotiations about the trade deal and political relationship when the transition arrangements expire in December. The omens are poor. The EU side looks to extensive framework in the political statement accompanying the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Johnson's team insists on a zero quota, zero tariff trade deal without obligations to maintain a level economic playing field, and there is a big gap on fishing arrangements and nothing close to a meeting of the minds on security and foreign policy. Britain's strategy so far has been to convince the EU that it is ready to step over the no-deal cliff edge. Some ministers say that this will force Brussels to make a better offer. Others do not care. The shock of a no-deal, they say, will be lost in the wreckage of COVID-19. Either way, there will be nothing heroic about the outcome of British exceptionalism, and it's truly run its course. The coming years will demand nothing much so long as an unrelenting slog to rebuild the economy after the ravages of the pandemic and the collateral damage promised by Brexit. Part of me wonders whether Mr. Johnson will decide that someone else would be better suited to such a banal endeavour. And it's true, Johnson doesn't have a map for an eye for details. He doesn't care. What he cares about is going out and giving speeches and going ooh rah rah and rallying the troops. This was potentially good for Brexit because what he wanted was to rally the Conservative base and the other people who were for Brexit. That's why he got in, to basically say we should continue on, but let's not talk about all these details that Brexit's going to do. Let's keep those to the side. Let's ooh rah 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 for Brexit. Of course, sooner or later, those details that you've shoved to the side over there actually matter. And this is where this whole Brexit thing continues a dangerous and deadly dip for this country. I really do fear what is going to happen. I mean, even if you take like COVID-19, let's say COVID-19 had never happened, right now, if you may cast your minds back to like early January and December where we were talking about the timeline for this year, now is when we were going to get even more clashes, and these are starting to happen. The UK is drastically overestimating itself to the EU. The EU is a far more powerful body than the UK wants to admit. And if it admitted that, then that means it has to make concessions. And if it's making concessions, that upsets the Brexiteers, who they have been primed and told by Johnson, Farage, whoever you want to name it, that we are have such a strong hand we can just walk away. But that's not true. It's not true in the slightest. And here's the thing. Even with the COVID-19 causing, again, a crisis in not only our economy, but economies around the world, Brexit will still cause an even bigger, longer slash. Remember, we are still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. We have not yet recovered. Not only that, but there are areas here. The town that I live in is still affected by the miners' strike of 1985. That hasn't gone away. Why? Well, it was actually going away under the Labour leadership. There were investment, there was stuff happening here. People, for example, went to university more for this town than ever have been seen before. In fact, this is actually what has led Barnsley to become a commuter town, because so many of these people went to university in those intervening years, me myself included. We ended up getting jobs in Sheffield and Leeds because that's where our degrees were worth more. And we chose to continue living in Barnsley. But there are others, many others out there in Barnsley, who haven't had that opportunity. And I always come back to opportunity. And we've had over 10 years now of austerity, of the government saying we can't spend any more money, but oh yeah, we've got all this money back here and we could tax the rich, but we're not going to do that. You've seen the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who basically said, well, we're going to give the NHS pay rises after all this. And then he's come out and said, oh, actually, we're going to have a public sector pay freeze. There are people you could maybe raise taxes on to get this money from. But, again, the Conservatives, and they ain't going to do that.